And I want you to smile and a little further down into it, put your hands together and kind of jam in with us and something like this. So glad morning. Well, I said so glad morning when this love is over.
I'd say good morning to you. Good morning. Nice turnout this morning. Really appreciate that. Good place to be in the Lord's house. Before we get into our lesson, we'll ask anyone in the sanctuary have a spoken prayer request. Okay, Steve. Ruby. Any others? Yes, brother.
Can you remember me and my family? Remember my two brothers and my mother, and remember Rusty and Marcia, and me and Deb were headed to Cleveland Tuesday morning, so pray that we'll have a safe trip and some good reports.
That's right. Sis.
Remember Sue, and remember my friend Angie, Mary, and Cheryl, and me and my family.
Okay.
And Donna.
Remember Aaron Moore and Walter Bagels.
Okay.
always remember my family, and we found out this week Tommy is now anemic, so that's another issue we'll be getting appointments for, so just remember him. And remember Amanda, she's on her way back to North Carolina to stay with us. So.
Any others?
Still remember Pat Robertson and Buddy and Georgia Freeman. I have a special unspoken, and remember our nation and Ukraine.
Amen.
Did remember my parents this morning.
Okay. Any others? Just remember our fellowship today, our worship. Just ask that His Spirit leads and guides us here today. And we just be drawn closer to Him. How about unspoken requests? God knows all about it. Ask you to stand. And Steve, if you'd lead us out, please.
Which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever.
Amen.
Amen.
So today we're going to start out the spring quarter. Hey, spring. Hooray, right? Lesson 1 in the spring quarter. Does everyone have a book or at least a sheet to read off of with today's lesson? If you don't, just raise your hand. Somebody will help you with that. Because it's a new book. I know Jeff passed them out, but we could have missed someone. I know we don't want that to happen. So if you need a book, just let us know. If not, then we're on page 1. And of our quarterly, we're coming to you again. We're still in Genesis, chapter 26. When we look at the title of today's lesson, conflict resolution. So let's just talk about this for a second. Do we have opportunities in our life to practice conflict resolution?
Yes.
We do. Is there any facet of our life where we don't deal with some level of conflict? I mean, your job, right? Your family. Have we not dealt with conflict? And have you been that mediator that's tried to pull them together to get people to get that compromise? How about our marriages? Are there not opportunity there to practice conflict resolution? Marriage is a compromise, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I thought about that. The writers of our material use that title, conflict resolution. And we absolutely, in all facets of our life, have conflict. In this world, we're always going to have conflict. And how do I handle that? Is it all about me? Am I going to be passive? Am I going to be understanding? Am I going to be the peacemaker? Or am I going to answer evil with evil? Where are you at in that? When you think about that? What's that? If you could fill in the blank, where would you be at? That's what I thought about that when I looked at this title. So, anyway, so this lesson's pretty neat in the fact it's a little bit of history lesson on God's people. But we're going to see how Isaac practices conflict resolution here. So when we think about the man Isaac in the Bible, there's not a whole lot about Isaac, okay? Chapter 26 in Genesis, where we're coming from, is pretty much the Isaac chapter. There's more in this chapter about Isaac than anywhere. There's other mentions of Isaac in the Bible, but in my studies I come across an interesting comment regarding Isaac. He was important. Obviously he was important. Remember, God was identified as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? So Isaac is mentioned. Isaac is one of the big three, if you will, if you want to look at it from that perspective. But he just wasn't quite as interesting as his father Abraham, or as we'll see later, his son Jacob. You know, they seemed to have got more press, if you will. They had more events going on. So perhaps though the most impressive feat, when we think of Isaac, what event comes to mind first when you think about Isaac?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice. And I remember we had this lesson, Sis spoke up about, what about Isaac, the faith it took for him to let Abraham lay him down on that altar, right? That we remember that. That's the thing about Isaac we remember most. I do. That's what I think. That's what I think of that event. When I think about the man Isaac, I think about that. How faithful he was. But there's not so much on record in God's Word about him as when you compare him with Abraham and then his son to come, Jacob. They just seem to have more reference to those guys, more accomplishments, if you will. So we're looking at the Isaac chapter here this morning. I ran across this, and it pretty much fits Isaac when you think about his place. When you think about his father and you think about Jacob, his son, said Isaac was the son of a great man and the father of a great man. It's kind of sandwiched in between there. I ran across that, thought it was interesting. So when we look at our chapter 26, the Isaac chapter, we start at verse 17. And sometimes when we start these lessons in the middle of a chapter, I think it's important to kind of go back. If you want to set the table for what we're getting ready to read about, we have to kind of go back just briefly and touch on what we skipped here. So what did we miss in the first 16 verses of this chapter 26? And what we missed is something real quick. I'm going to go over it because it's not in your text, but we could title it "Like Father, Like Son." What do I mean? Remember from a few weeks back we had a lesson where Abraham, instead of staying faithful and staying home to deal with the famine, he left and went into Egypt. Remember that? And he ran into trouble, didn't he? Well, here in chapter 26, the very same thing happens to Isaac. He will run to Egypt to escape a famine. And when God told him to stay put, like his father, and there's going to be another underlying lesson here, like father, like son. Our kids watch us, don't they? They learn from us, don't they? Anyway, and while in Egypt, he would lie about his wife, Rebekah. She was so fair to look upon, she was so attractive, that he was afraid that the Philistines would steal her. So when he escaped into their country to run from the famine, he told him that she was his sister. And Abraham did the same thing with Sarah when he ran into Egypt some years before that. So Isaac has these couple of events here early in the chapter that you could kind of say were failures in the sense of his, but it was a lack of faith that led to some problems. And again, we can relate on that too. We all have been there and done that. His lack of faith creates this whole scene that we're going to actually read about from verses 17 on. But while riding out the famine in Egypt, Abimelech, he was the king of the Philistines. We're going to see him here in a minute. Asked him to leave. Isaac's people prospered. His herds prospered. They were increased in numbers. Abimelech, the pagan king, sees that, and he's feeling threatened by Isaac and his people, and asks him to leave. So that's where our text starts today. I just kind of wanted to set y'all up where we're going to start when we start reading. So now our text, the first part of this chapter kind of shines a bad light on Isaac, where he lost faith and he got into some trouble. He did like his father did when it pertains to the famine. But now our verses that we're going to read, we see a different, shines a better light on Isaac. It shows great patience. We're going to see great resolve and that conflict resolution that our title mentions. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to kick it off with a little bit of explanation of what's happening here when we look at chapter 26. So we're going to start out in verse 17. I'll read the first verse. You guys read after me, and we'll see what we can glean from this. And Isaac departed thence and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there.
And Isaac digged again the wells of water, which they had digged in the days of Abraham his father. For the Philistines had stopped him after the death of Abraham, and he called their names after the names by which his father had called them.
And Isaac's servants digged in the valley and found there a well of springing water.
And the Reuben and the Lord answered out his servant, saying, the water is ours. And he called the name of the well Esek, because they strove with him.
And they digged another well and strove for that also, and he called the name of it Sitnah.
And he removed from thence and digged another well, and for that they strove not. And he called the name of it Rehoboth. And he said, for now the Lord hath made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land.
And he went up from thence to Beersheba.
And the Lord appeared unto him the same night, and said, I am God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am on thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake.
And he built an altar there, and he called upon the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants digged a well.
Then Abimelech went to the view from Gerar, and Ahazah, one of his friends of Pashol, the chief captain of his army.
And Isaac said unto them, Wherefore come ye to me, seeing ye hate me, and have sent me away from you?
And they said, we all serve that the Lord was with thee. And he said, let there be now none betwixt us, even betwixt us and thee, and let us make a covenant with thee.
That thou wilt do us no hurt, as we have not touched thee, and as we have done unto thee nothing but good, and have sent thee away in peace. Thou art now the blessed of the Lord.
And he made them a feast, and they did eat and drink.
And they rose up betimes in the morning, and sware one another, and Isaac sent away, and they departed from him in peace. Amen. A lot of verses there, but really, there's pretty simple clean cut what's going on here, okay? If we look at verses 17 through 20, where we start, first of all, there's no rivers in this region, okay? Like I said earlier, Isaac has been told by the Philistines to leave. He's leaving to go back to Canaan. There's no rivers in this region. And water is life, right? You got to have water. So in this part of the country, we're so arid and so dry, they capture rainwater when it rains as best they can, and they dig wells. It's all about the wells. The wells are vital in this area. And it's a lot of work to secure that well, to dig that well and prepare it. So Isaac is leaving, and he finds water on his way back to Canaan. He needs water. You got to remember, he's got a caravan. He's got all of his people. So it's vital that they find water for their livestock, for themselves. So in verse 18, he goes back. He finds a well that was once his father's, and it has been filled in. The Philistines filled it in. And he redigs that well. And he named that well as his father originally named it. In verse 19, it says that this well had springing water. So this was a good well, wasn't it? I mean, when the water is actually springing from that hole in the ground, that's a good well. And then in verse 20, the herdsmen of Gerar, that's the people he's trying to leave their territory, they said the well was theirs. Did you see that? There was this, and here's that contention we're talking about. Here's that conflict we're talking about. Isaac changed the name of the well to Esek, which means contention, is what that word means, because it made others jealous. And we can all relate. Have we been jealous of the success of others? Has there been people jealous of our success? Probably. Well, you see that happening here. But this is pretty important. This is water. We have to have water to survive. So, but notice, keep that one that wants to keep the peace. He wants to avoid conflict. What does he do? In verse 21, it says, and they digged another well. Peacefully, Isaac chooses not to fight over the well. He moves on and digs another one. So verse 21, he dug a well, it says, and he called it Sitnah. So here's well number 2. He moves to another spot, he digs another well, and here's that conflict. It pops up again. The text says that they strove for that also. They are the Philistines. They strove for that well, meaning they wanted it, they claimed it. They're saying the well is theirs. That's what that means. So Isaac names that one Sitnah, which means opposition. So now I've moved to the second well. I dug a second well, and the Philistines are telling me, no, you can't have that one either. That one's ours. So what does he do? He moves again. Verse 22, and he removed from thence and digged another well. See that in verse 22? This is the third well. So finally, this third time, Isaac has moved far enough away that he feels it's safe to dig. Let's dig here. It made me think about the centuries-long quarrel that goes on in that area today. The fight over territory. I thought of that. Remember the first well that he dug here? It was originally dug by his father, Abraham. So you would think that he would have had right to that territory, right? If his dad... But no, the Philistines said, no, you can't have it. Does that sound familiar when we think about that area and the conflict of territory that goes on today? It was happening there, wasn't it? Did you see that? That far back, it was an issue. That's my territory. You can't have that well. Well, my father dug this well. No, move on. You can't. So what does he do? He moves on. He digs a second well. Same thing happens to him there. Now he's here in this verse 22. He's dug the third well. So he's pushed out. Instead of fighting them, he moves on. So he calls this well Rehoboth, which means room for us. And so he just kept moving until he found that peaceful spot. And apparently this is the spot, because so far it seems everything's okay. No one, I'm sure he's looking over his shoulder. Are they going to come after me here and tell me this is theirs also? But notice, this must be a peaceful spot. And I thought about, there's no quarrel finally with the third attempt. Well, there's no quarrel, and he names the well room for us. So Isaac, again, wanting to avoid that conflict, going back to the title. So when I thought about that, he was a peacemaker, wasn't he? Isaac was. When you think about how he was pushing around, and that made me think too, was he weak? Was he, did he? Well, we're going to talk about that later. Some people would look at this as a symbol of weakness, but we're going to see at the end of this lesson it was a symbol of God's provision, and that is recognized by his enemy, but we'll get to that later. But I thought about us in our life. Are we those peacemakers? Would we have that kind of patience? Would we have that kind of resolve to try to... The author of Romans wrote in chapter 12, verse 18, as much as lies in you, be at peace with all people. That doesn't mean it's 100% all the time. It said, the author of Romans says this, whoever wrote that in Romans knew that it's a struggle. Sometimes we have difficulty. He wrote, as much as lies in you, be at peace with all people. In other words, do the best you can. It is a challenge sometimes, isn't it? But as much as you can, be at peace with people. I thought that was interesting. Kind of fit with what we see here. Any comments so far on conflict? How would you feel? How good would you do if this was your family and you've had to dig now a third well to provide for them? Would you at some point want to fight back? I thought about that. How would you handle this situation? How would some of the other characters we know in the Bible handle this? You think King David would have done this? No. He would have fought the first time, probably. How about Simon Peter? Do you think he would have been this understanding? How about John Gross? I mean, come on. Could we have practiced that kind of patience and that kind of desire to be peaceful as Isaac was in this situation? You got to remember, this is water. This is not, a luxury item. This is a necessity we're talking about here. And yet he demonstrated that kind of resolve. I thought it was pretty neat.
We'll fight over things that ain't near.
Exactly. Thank you. Exactly. He had wealth. He had men. He was prosperous. Remember, they asked him to leave their country because they felt he was a threat. So at some point, he could have absolutely stood his ground and fought back, don't you think? But he didn't do that. Interesting. I mean, at least well number 2, I believe I'd have been calling my men together and say, we're going to fight these people, at some point. But no, he went all the way to well number 3, and he was still kind of looking over his shoulder, I believe. But verses 23, 24, and 25, and he went thence to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared unto him that same night and said, I am the God of Abraham, thy father, fear not. For I am with thee, and I will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. And he built an altar there, and called upon the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants digged a well. So here's that third well. So, all this conflict leads him back to Beersheba. This is where his father Abraham had been before. And if you notice in the text we just read, this is where God personally calls on him. We know that Isaac's father Abraham had several appearances of the Lord, but here seems to be the first time it happened for Isaac. Matter of fact, God appeared to all the patriarchs in the Bible except Joseph. He appeared to Abraham, and here Isaac, and later we know he appeared to Jacob. He said, "Do not fear, for I am with you." You know, obviously, Isaac probably had a reason to fear, didn't he? He'd already dug 3 wells. He'd probably looking over his shoulder thinking, you know, are they going to come after us here? But God says, fear not. There had been this contention between his herdsmen and the Philistines over these wells, so he had to think that perhaps maybe it could happen again. Verse 25, he builds an altar. This again made me think about like father, like son. Many times Abraham built altars, and here Isaac builds one. You know, when I started my little introduction earlier, I talked about how Isaac copied after his father in a bad way when he didn't have the faith and he left the famine to go to Egypt, just like Abraham did some years. Now, Isaac wasn't born yet, but he heard the stories, I'm sure. He knew about this. And yet he did it just like his dad did. He fled. He went into Egypt to flee to get away from all that. But here is a trait that he took after his dad. It's a good thing. He built an altar. So I thought here he followed Dad's good example. Isaac did. Abraham built many altars. We gone through those Abraham lessons, and he built many altars. Many times Abraham, if it was a spot where he was blessed and God intervened, the very next thing he did was build an altar right there to mark that spot, to have worship in that spot. So here Isaac follows that example of Abraham. You know, demonstrating, giving God recognition, right? Demonstrating the importance of worship, because that's what they did at the altar. They worshipped. And trust. It was a symbol of trust. We think about the area of Beersheba. Originally, Abraham lived there. Now, Isaac has gone through this whole ordeal, and now he's back home, so to speak. So he lost his faith for a minute, and it led to hardship. Have we been there? This is another repetitive theme from other lessons that we've had so far in the last quarter. He strayed off. He lost faith temporarily. He left his region. He got mixed up with the wrong people, and now he's trying to flee. He has all this hardship, this turmoil, this conflict. But if he would have been faithful all along, we probably wouldn't know this would happen. So, do we sometimes find that we sometimes get off course like Isaac did, and we have to go through some bitterness, we have to go through some hardship? If that bitterness, that trial, that hardship brings us back to Him, they were blessings, weren't they? They were. At the time when we went through it, we didn't understand it. You know, why is this happening? But now you look back and you're like, God, you had a plan for me. Now I'm back. I'm back with you. You know, thank you for bringing me back. That's kind of what happened here. Isaac is now back home where he's out of the harm. But if those unpleasant things drive you back home, they're blessings. So now our text on 26 through, this is kind of, like I said, there's not a whole lot of depth in here. It's kind of a history lesson and some demonstration of God's provision and faith as well. But in verses 26 through 31, basically the natives make peace, okay? The natives make peace. They see the Lord in God's people. They see the Lord in the leadership style, in the conflict resolution of the leader, Isaac, of their leader Isaac. It says Abimelech, remember him, he was the king from Gerar, went to him. And Abhuzah, one of his friends, and Phicol, the chief captain of his army. So here's the king getting his top aide and the chief over the military, and they're going to catch up with Isaac in the desert. And Isaac says to them, well, basically in verse 27, why are you coming to me? You hate me, so to speak. You made me leave your land. So Abimelech makes this trip to catch up with Isaac and his entourage. And Isaac says, why are you coming after me? You hate me. It's a logical question, right? I mean, after all the trouble he's gone through with the wells and being run out of their land. And what is Abimelech's response? He says, verse 28, we saw certainly that the Lord was with thee. And we said, let there now be an oath betwixt us, even betwixt us and thee, and let us make a covenant with thee. So, this heathen king witnessed this godly man in action, and it made an impression on him. You see that? He grabs his lieutenant, his top military man, his advisor, and they want to go talk to Isaac. They're impressed by this. He says, we have certainly seen the Lord is with you. See what Isaac's actions showed the Philistines. He didn't respond. During that conflict that we talked about over the wells, Isaac didn't respond with evil, did he? He went on. He was the peacemaker. You know, you could make an argument that Isaac might have been weak. Some people would look at that as a weakness, how Isaac let those people push him around. You could make that argument. However, this king decided to run Isaac down and catch up with him because he didn't see a weak man. He saw a godly man. He saw a man with his God's protection, and that made an impression on him. Verse 29, thou wilt do us no hurt, and we have not touched thee, and as you have done unto thee nothing but good, and have sent thee away in peace. Here is the key. This heathen king that says, thou art now the blessed of the Lord. What an impression that is made on the king. So they have a feast, and then the next day they go their separate ways. And there's peace for now. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, this influence of Isaac was not a weak man. This influence of Isaac was a godly man, and they noticed it. Verse 28, he said, we saw certainly that God was with thee. In other words, we see your God is real, and we don't want any trouble. You know? Any thoughts? Yes, brother.
Are they the same that pursued him in the first two wells?
Yeah.
That's what I'm
Yeah. Yeah, and the herdsmen of that country were the ones that was kind of the aggressors, if you will. So I believe the king was kind of getting updates, and he was, he wasn't pushing Isaac, I don't believe. It was said that it was the herdsmen of Gerar that Isaac had the conflict. Well, this king is over those herdsmen, and he must have got word, and he was like, wait a minute, this is a unique individual. Tell me more, let's watch this. And then after the third well, the king said, okay, I want to meet this man. I want to talk to him. So they have this peace agreement, they have a feast, and they go their separate ways. So when you think about this lesson, first of all, anybody got anything to add? Any thoughts on it? Would we be as eager to find peace in that situation like Isaac was, I think we would have a hard time with that, wouldn't we?
These must be pretty good sized wells, to feed a caravan. And so, you'd be ready to fight over them.
Yeah.
I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, that we just need to practice that, and we're all guilty of not practicing it. Sometimes, I mean, I talked to people yesterday, and, you know, they say things to you, and sometimes you just have to let it go, rather than argue with them and stuff, you just have to. And there's things, you have to walk away from things, you know, and stuff, and unfortunately, a lot of us don't, you know, I'm guilty of not always doing what God wants me to do and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think this lesson is a lesson for us all to learn, that we need to practice more of.
I just think, you know, the other day, you know, you talk to people, sometimes when you talk to people, they can say things to you that really hurt. And I got thinking about the scriptures where it says, a wise man knows when to hold his tongue.
That's right.
Keeps himself out of trouble.
Yeah, that's true. Well, a couple of takeaways that I got out of this. Parents, your kids are watching. You know, we saw good and bad here. We saw Isaac kind of follow just after his father's footsteps when it came to, when the famine occurred, and he ran. You know, he got scared and ran to the Egypt, just like his father did some years before, and absolutely even end up lying to the people in the other country about his wife, just verbatim, almost exactly the same thing happened. To worship when God intervened, and his father Abraham certainly was big on altar building, and he must have been paying attention. He wasn't alive on those occasions when his father built them, but he had to heard the stories and be aware of that his dad was an altar builder. Also, I think how Isaac avoids conflict, it showed a great deal of maturity and restraint, and we lack that sometimes. And this, I'm speaking from experience, so it's all about me, right? Do we have that? Do we let that kind of guide our decisions? And when we have that conflict, opportunity to resolve it, and we should live peacefully with those around us. Another thing I think it's in here is when we are at peace with God and we are trusting in Him, should our relations with our brother and sister be stronger than ever? Yeah, I think so. You remember the king told Isaac after he tracked him down in the desert, he said, "We've seen that the Lord is truly with you." Would your people at work, would your people at school, at wherever you socialize, would they say that about you? Would they say that about me? Do you think about that? You know, Isaac's handling all this trouble made an impression on the people. On a pagan king who did not know Yahweh, did not know Isaac's God, but he saw Isaac's God, didn't he, in Isaac's actions. So, do we make that kind of impression on others?
I think it takes more energy to argue than it does just to move on.
Yeah,
You know,
that's right.
Not only that, but because of his choice to move on, in the end result, which is what is supposed to happen in all of our lives, the Lord was seen and He was glorified.
So when conflict arises, You know it's gonna happen. Mark my word, this coming week, you're gonna have conflict. Somewhere. How will you handle it? Will you answer evil with evil? Will you fight back? Are we going to escalate the conflict? Or are we going to be that peacemaker? Are we going to compromise and project the right way to conflict resolution, as the title implied this morning? So, anyway, that's all I had. Appreciate it. Anything else you want to add?
Well, I know a preacher a long time ago named Steve Roman. Heard he's no longer living. I think he was preacher back home. He once said that hear no evil, speak no evil, the circumcision of the ears and the mouth.
Amen.
I have one. You were
Yes, sir.
talking also about a bad situation and not knowing the good of it. And immediately I thought of my mom. She actually died at 64 years old from a fentanyl methadone overdose, and that actually led me to was the beginning actually of where I am today. I battled opiates for 20 years, and she died June 11th, December 26, 2015. Was the last time that I ever took it. But I continue to smoke and stuff like that. But I tell people all the time that I am the good of a bad situation like that. And a lot of times I tell people that one of the best things that ever happened to me was my mom dying. And I love her and stuff, but it opened my eyes and made me grow up.
A lot of testimony. That's a strong testimony. Yeah. Thank you, brother, for sharing that.